negative exact is our bread and butter negative match type. It's the most widely used by far. It allows us to eliminate a very specific search string from triggering impressions. So it's very controlled, very targeted. Uh, the most common case where we'd add negative exact keywords would be in cases where a specific search term isn't converting. So it's running up clicks, not producing sales. So zero ACOS, zero sales, high clicks, clicks above typical conversion rate, or clicks over the typical level of clicks between orders for your products. That would be a good case to look at adding negative exacts. So we'll typically set a threshold where we'll systematically negate those, maybe 2 times the average of clicks between orders, and then negate those specific search terms that aren't leading to conversions. We'll also add negative exact keywords for specific search terms that produce a very high ACOS. So typically, when a search term or when a keyword is performing, a search term converts and it's producing a high ACOS, what we'll do is we'll move it into a manual campaign, a highly targeted one like exact match, and we'll set a bid where it'll produce a reasonable ACOS. So if its ACOS is too high, then let's control that specific search term. Let's bid it down, bid it to a level where it'll produce a reasonable ACOS or just not generate impressions. It's more valuable to take that approach, manage it through bids when it is converting versus adding negative exact match keywords for it. But in those cases where you're finding search terms that are irrelevant or have high clicks without conversions, that's where we eliminate those specific searches from triggering impressions. So where this really has a huge impact is in your auto campaigns. When you eliminate those really poor performers in auto campaigns, those specific searches that Amazon continually awards impressions to your products for, your spend is then allocated to better converting, more productive search terms. You can bid more aggressively in those auto campaigns when you eliminate that unproductive spend. When you bid more aggressively, it allows you to reach a different mix of targets, of search terms. So by continually refining your auto campaigns through negatives, you can really get more aggressive in them, discover more search terms to move down the funnel.
Yeah, so a couple key takeaways there is we always prefer to use bid control over negatives to control performance. So in auto campaigns, that is not an option since you just set the bids on the higher level targeting options that you have for auto campaigns. So for auto campaigns, our big performance control is using negatives. For our manual campaigns, we highly prefer to use bids first and keep reducing the bids down to get them to a point where we're getting those returns that we're looking for in terms of ACOS or ROAS from those search terms. And eventually, we'll probably bid them down low enough where they don't get impressions or where they're getting a solid return. But for those cases where we have match types like broad or phrase, that's where we can use specific negatives to weed out any versions of the search terms from those broader phrase keywords to make sure that they don't show up and hurt performance. Another key note is that for our exact keywords or for our product targeting campaigns where we're targeting specific ASINs, instead of setting negatives, if they don't perform well and we reduce bids over time, or say they get moved to an exact campaign or to a product targeting campaign and then they don't generate sales, instead of setting negatives, we prefer to pause them. And the key reason is that it's much easier to see why they're not generating impressions. If a keyword is paused, it's very obvious why it's not generating impressions. If it's activated, if it's enabled, but we have a negative, there's 2 different spots that we have to look to try to figure out why it's not generating impressions overall. So in general, auto campaigns, negatives are great for controlling performance. For phrase and broad keyword campaigns, and also for category campaigns and product targeting, negatives can be great to weed out any search terms that we don't want to show up. And then for exact and ASIN product targeting, we pause those instead of using negatives, just so it's much more obvious why those keywords or those product targets are not generating impressions. So, Matt, this is probably a good jumping off point too to talk about negative product targets and any situations that you use negative product targets for.
Sure. Yeah. So negative product targets are very similar to negative exact keywords. They prevent impressions for a very specific target. So you add a negative product target to a campaign or ad group, it's going to prevent that specific ASIN from triggering. It'll prevent your ads from having an impression on that specific ASIN's product page. So much like an exact, it would prevent a very specific target from triggering an impression. Negative product targets, the same deal. Like you said, when we have an exact match keyword, we would choose to pause the keyword rather than add a negative exact. Same thing with product targets. Product targets are ASIN targets specifically. We would choose to pause that in a manual product targeting campaign over adding a negative product target to that campaign or ad group. So where we use them would be auto campaigns and category targets. Auto campaigns, they have the same utility as negative exact. We're able to eliminate unproductive spend. That improves the performance of that campaign, of that ad group, and we can bid more aggressively as a result of that in that auto campaign. So huge benefits in eliminating unproductive spend, so we can drive more spend to productive spend by using them. Same thread for category targeting. Category targets target all product targets within a specific category, all products within a category. So if you're running category targeting, you can check search term reports, see what ASINs aren't producing sales that have a material amount of clicks or are producing sales but at an extremely high ACoS, and you can add a negative product target to the ad group that houses that category target and eliminate that ASIN from generating more spend. So again, improve performance of that category targeting ad group by eliminating unproductive spend. In turn, you can bid more, reach a new subset of targets from that approach.
Yep. So that's the performance control that we use for negatives. The other piece that we use negatives is for deduplication or for isolation between our different campaigns. So overall, we talked about our campaign funnel structure in previous episodes. And so just to summarize, what we're trying to do is go from very broad down the funnel to much more exact. And so with those campaign funnel structures, we have auto campaigns, which feed into, say on the keyword side, manual phrase, and then going to manual exact. And what we'll do is when moving between auto campaigns to manual campaigns, if we have a keyword that converts, it's a strong performer, and we want to move it to manual campaigns, we gain a lot of control when moving it to those manual campaigns. And so instead of having the option for Amazon to choose whether they show that search term in the auto campaign or the manual campaign, what we'll do is we'll set a negative phrase in the auto campaign. And so, for instance, if warm winter gloves converts in our auto campaign, we determine it's a high performer and want to move it downstream, what we'll do is we'll set a phrase keyword in a manual campaign for warm winter gloves, and then we'll also set a negative phrase in the auto campaign. And what that does is it makes sure that any search terms that are tied to warm winter gloves now shows up in our manual campaigns. So one note is that we do not do this because the campaigns are going to compete against each other or anything. So if you have redundant keywords in multiple campaigns, it's not like your individual campaigns are going to drive up the bid against each other and compete against each other. So that is a common myth out there, and that is simply not the case. But we like to make sure that we're forcing Amazon to show them in the manual campaigns because we have much more control as we go. So we will always set negatives in the auto campaigns when we're moving search terms or product targets that convert well downstream to manual campaigns. So the other piece that you can do is when moving from phrase to exact, say red warm winter gloves converts really well in the phrase campaign, from the warm winter gloves phrase, and I want to move that to an exact. So I add an exact keyword for red warm winter gloves, and then I could set a negative exact in the phrase campaign to make sure that any impressions for red warm winter gloves shows up in the exact campaign. So we don't do that. And the key reason is that when Amazon is determining whether or not to show your ads, they factor two things. So one is bids, and the other one is relevancy. And relevancy is determined just from the history of that keyword that you entered in. And unfortunately, relevancy for specific search terms does not carry over into new campaigns. So when we add red warm winter gloves into the exact campaign, it's starting with a fresh slate again for overall relevancy. And so what could happen is that if we forced red warm winter gloves to show in the exact campaign, you may end up paying more on a cost per click basis, or worst case, since it doesn't have an established relevancy, you may not get any impressions for that. And so what we really like to do is not negate between the manual campaigns, because we still have a lot of control on the phrase side, and we still have we gain even more control on the exact side. So it's definitely a trade-off. By not forcing it into the exact campaign, you do lose a little bit of control, but the upside is that you don't have these relevancy impacts by starting fresh again. So what we like to do is let Amazon choose which keyword, which campaign, which ad group it really wants to show that search term in. So if it prefers to show it in the phrase keyword and we can get a lower cost per click for getting our ad shown for the exact same search term, we're going to do that. And so it's definitely a trade-off in data isolation versus potentially getting a lower cost per click, or getting more impressions just because you have a higher determined relevancy. In a perfect world, we would do full isolation. We used to do that, but it's just due to this factor with the relevancy and how Amazon determines relevancy that we no longer do pure keyword isolation between our manual campaigns.